Hello and welcome to my course on AI automation powered by n8n. In the last lesson, I introduced the concept of code node by going into details of what expressions are, where the limitations of expressions are in n8n, and why do you need code node. In today's lesson, I'm going to deep dive into the concept of code node and what you should keep in mind specifically when you are not outputting the equal number of outputs as you have got the inputs. So what exactly is code node in n8n? Well, a code node allows you to write custom JavaScript or Python code inside n8n in multi-line. We saw expressions in the last lesson of this course where you are limited to a single line of code, but code node allows you to write multi-line code inside n8n. It runs it as a single individual step in your entire n8n workflow and lets you manipulate data, filter data, and generate new objects or new kind of data. Now let's go to the screen share and start learning hands-on on code node. So I'm logged into the cloud instance of my n8n workspace, and as usual I have opened up a new workflow. It's my workflow. We'll call it code node lesson and we'll just save it over here. And to start with, we need a trigger. I'll add a manual trigger over here, and what you have to do, click on this and we'll search for code node, and you would see a code node icon coming up over here. And as soon as I click on it, you can see that a code node has been added to our workflow and what parameters it allows. So first of all, the second parameter is of interest, which is basically the language. And as I told you, it allows you to write code in JavaScript as well as Python, which is in beta right now, has some limitations. We'll talk about it later in the lesson. However, it supports two most common and most popular programming languages out there in the software industry. So with this parameter, you can choose whatever programming language you are comfortable with throughout this lesson. And in fact, the entire course I have been using JavaScript, so I'll continue to use that. So you can see a basic stub of code which is multi-line in nature is already provided. If I click on execute step, it is going to output my new field :1. That is what we have written over here. Because nothing is coming inside, it has executed one and provided us one value. So this was just a dummy code over here. But now let's look at the first configuration which is there in the code node that we call mode. So there are two types of modes that are available in code node. First one is run once for all items. You are going to run this code only once, no matter how many items are inputted into the code node. Remember from the past lessons that every node in n8n executes based on the number of inputs it is receiving. For example, if you put a if node, there are 10 items on it, 10 times the if condition will be evaluated. But over here in code node, you have the control over it that you want all those 10 items to be processed at once by the code that you have written. Then you are going to choose run once for all items. Otherwise, you can override it and say that I want to run my piece of code once for every item, which is more like a default behavior of other nodes. But for code node, generally the default behavior is that you want to run all the data transformation that you want to have on all the data that is coming as an input on the code node. But the next thing comes, how do you access the data in your code which is coming inside this code node? Well, for that, if you have chosen mode equals to run once for all items, then what you do is you use $input.all. Otherwise, if I choose run once for each item, you see that it has already converted the default code to $input. So based on the mode of execution that you have selected in code node, the access mechanism for the data would change. Either you are going to use $input.all or just $input.item would give you the access to the item that is being processed one at a time by the code node. So since we have JavaScript over here, everything that we are trying to access is being accessed by $sign. So if I just delete it over here and type in $, I have access to all these things: $ifempty, $if, $execution, $binary, the name of the node, $execution. So all these things, you can see $input is there. So many things are there that you can access using $ when you have language as JavaScript selected. However, if I change the language to Python, then you can see that you have to use underscore instead of $sign. So if you are using underscore, that means you have access to the same type of elements or data or functions that you were trying to use using the JavaScript as language for the code node that you are trying to write the code in it. So if I delete this and say underscore, you can see that many of the functions or properties or methods that were accessible using $sign in case of JavaScript are now accessible with underscore in case of language Python is selected. And again, I'm telling you that Python is in beta mode right now. It is not fully launched, but still the basic piece of code you can still write. Now that you have a basic understanding of what code node is, what kind of parameters it allows us to select or change, let's deep dive and write some pieces of code so that you get a better hang of this code node. So I'll go back over here, and for that we'll try to get some real data out of it. And in order to get the real data, I'm going to click on this and I'm going to add a Google Sheet. And because we have to fetch data, I'm going to use get rows in the sheet. So over here I have selected a already configured account, one of my own. I have the operation as get rows, and over here I've select some orders data. So I had this mock orders data. I'll select this one, and let's open up mock orders data. And what we are going to do is execute this step, and it is going to fetch us all the order data that is there. So remember, here nothing is there. We talked about this example in first section of this course where we were talking about the basics. So I'm going to add order details as well, because I want to write a piece of code which calculates the total dollar amount for which the orders have been placed in my organization. So let's add another Google Sheet over here. And we had get rows, and this time I'm going to select order details. So I had mock order details data, and I'll click on execute step. Oops, something has gone wrong. Okay, I did not select the sheet. So we have to select the sheet here, and I'll click on execute step. And now you can see there is unit price, there is total price. So it is going to tell us what orders were placed and the total amount of each order. That is the kind of logic that I want to implement using a code node. So now we'll go back. But first thing what we have to do is, so this was our headers data. This is like our details data. I want to merge both of them, and we have already seen merge node in action. So let's merge this. All right. And I'll put an input, another one over here, and let's configure the merge node with, we don't want to append, we want to like combine, and we want to combine on what, like if I execute this one, we want to combine on order ID. So let's click on execute step. Now there must be 291 records. Yes, there are 291 records, and you can see that order ID 001 is there, in which this particular product ID or product name was ordered, and then we have the same order under which a different product was ordered, and then there was a third product. So all the order header details are same for this particular order. However, the number of products that are ordered in this are 3 in quantity. So what I would like is that we write some sort of custom logic that basically parses all this data, find out order ID which are unique, and in order ID what was the total sum of order that was placed. So I want to calculate the total for each order. So let's go back and do that. Now we have the merge data. I'll just click on this to format it better. Now we'll add a code node over here. And as you can see, now the merge node is inputting 291 items into it, and the mode that we have selected is run once for all items. That means all 291 items are accessible using $input.all. In case if I select this as run once for each item, code is going to run for each 291 item. I don't want that, because I want to have all the 291 data records together so that I can fetch or separate out unique orders and then combine these totals which are there in each of these records to be outputted as order ID and the total of the order. And let's execute the code node and see what happens. So what this piece of code is doing is it is fetching all the items from input.all. Every item is being fetched. For each item in the JSON, a my new field equals to 1 is getting added, and then finally it is returning the entire input as is. So basically this has modified the input that was there and added a new property called my new field, which value is equals to 1 over here. And you can see that all these 291 records now has 1 value in it. However, we are interested in outputting altogether a different piece of data where we want all the unique orders to be outputted having the totals for each order. What I mean by that is, you can see this order 001 has one product with a total price of 769.6, and then there is another one which has a 256.02, and then the third record is also there which is 226.86. The output should look like ORD 00001, and the total of the order equals to this plus this plus this. So that is what we are going to write as a piece of code in it. So now I'm going to click on this to expand it a bit, and then we are going to delete this. And now another thing that you can notice is we don't need to write double curly braces, and you can start typing in the code in the code node as is in this box. So what I've done is I've already written the piece of code that does the exact same job, so I'll just paste it over here. So what this piece of code is doing is, first we are going to build a lookup object to annotate the totals of all the orders which are there, because orders are scattered per item, like the product that was ordered, and then we have a relationship of order header along with other details. So that's why we are keeping this order totals dictionary over here. Now we are going to loop through all the items which are there using $input.all. This gives us access to all the 291 objects, and one by one, item by item, we are going to have order ID and price calculated, and the values of order ID and price can be accessed using the dot notation. So we can say item.json.total price and item.json.order ID. So this gives us the order ID and price. Now in our dictionary object, we are checking whether the order ID is already mentioned or not. If not, then we are going to insert it. Order totals order ID equals to 0. So we are going to start with 0 total sum of the order that was placed, and then we are going to see if this is the order ID, we are going to add the price of it. So this plus equals to means whatever has been added, add the amount if a new item is found later on in the array of objects or list of objects that we already have. So this is going to create a order totals dictionary with the order ID as key and the total being the value of it. Now in the second step, we are going to convert this into JSON wrapper, which is the output that the code node expects you to output the data in. If you are not following this particular guideline, then the data that you are going to output is not going to be accepted by n8n, and your code node will fail, or there will be some sort of an error. And that's why you can see that I have some result list. This is the result list that we are going to return it at the end, because remember, everything in n8n must be returned as a JSON list, and it needs to be wrapped under JSON colon, and every item should be there, so that you can have this sort of mechanism of item.json.order ID to access the values of the data that you are sending. And that's exactly what we are doing over here. So first we have all the keys as order ID stored over here, then we are going to have an ID as constant. We are going through all the order IDs and we are pushing it and forming the JSON over here with order underscore ID colon ID and order underscore total equals to, again we have used an inbuilt function over here as number, which is basically transforming our whatever order total was against that order ID into a regular number, and then we are returning the final result. So if I go back now and execute this step, so you will see that we have order ID and order total as a number with 2 decimal places. And that's why we have this piece of code which says 2 fixed in brackets 2 decimal places. So that's how you get the rounded off order total. So now you can see that this is entirely new set of data that you have created, and now the number of outputs are different. You can see that number of outputs are 100 now instead of 291s that were inputted into this node. And like I said, you must understand the data structure that needs to be returned by a code node, because otherwise if you're not outputting the data in the right data format or data structure that n8n expects, your node is going to fail. n8n is going to report an error on it. So that's one of the most important concept to understand when you are using code node. In n8n, all data passed between nodes is an array of objects. Even if it is a single item, you must enclose it into an array. Nodes can process multiple items, and this is the basic default structure that it looks like. At the top you can see that it is enclosing with these square brackets, which tells us that it's a list or an array of items. Then within that, this first item starts, and for each of them you have JSON colon and then whatever the data is there. So example data over here is apple colon beets carrot, and then again you have a child item into it, which is dil equals to 1. So you need to wrap each item in another object with the key JSON. So this is the JSON data that you see in each and every input output. However, in some of the nodes you can also have access to binary data, which is in terms of files. So for that, The data structure must be, if you are working with files, then you have to use binary colon, and within that you would have the example data of everything related to that particular file or binary that you are trying to work with in your n8n workflow. And you can see that the data colon part is the most mandatory field, and rest of the fields like mime type, file extension, file name, all these are optional, but these are recommended best practices that you should have them so that you are providing maximum amount of information with your binary data. So that is the data structure that each and every node in n8n expects. And when you are dealing with code node where you can break this data structure, you must understand the concept of this data structure so that you can return whatever transformation that you have done on your input. The output data must always follow this data structure. There are a couple of limitations as well when you are using code node that you must be familiar with. First one is related to the external libraries or external packages support. So if you are using the cloud version of n8n, you cannot import any kind of npm packages, which is like node package manager for Python based programming. If you are self-hosting n8n, then you can import some or use built-in components or npm packages which are available in n8n. Second limitation is using the code node, you cannot access the file system or you cannot make an HTTP web request call or an API call. In order to use these functionalities, you need to use specific nodes that we are definitely going to cover in the subsequent lessons of this course. And those nodes are, first one is HTTP node, and the next lesson is about HTTP node, and the second one is read write file from disk node. So these two nodes have specific purpose in n8n. So let me break this part 1 of this code node lesson over here. In the next part video of this lesson, I want to spend more time to explain another important concept of code node in detail, which is item linking or data linking, because without its understanding you may end up breaking workflows without even knowing what is wrong with them. So I'll see you in the next lesson of this course.